You have an acorn and you have a stone. And in principle, I can say that instead of giving this lecture this funny title, A Theory of Change, I should have called it The Acorn and the Stone. Would have been easier and a little more, how shall I say, with questions attached to. I will come back to the acorn and the stone. For the time being, I'm only allowing you and inviting you to speculate. Why an acorn and a stone? Actually, our own existence in this world is due to change. Our own means we as human beings. But everything else around, as you look at nature, is the result of change. If this is the only sentence that you would take with you, you're going to say, boy, did I waste my time. And my good friend who came, where did you come from today?
From Bremen.
From Bremen, okay, so it's not so far. Would also say, why did I waste my time? I want to bring into the discussion the important subject of why should we be interested in change and how do we deal with change. And in this respect, I'm starting by making you aware that from a certain perspective, the nature of knowledge acquisition is such that it is quite circular. We are looking at things as I'm going to look at this object, and then I'm going to describe it. The description that will result from my effort is really going to close a circle in which this description should adequately capture enough of this object as I try to describe it. Why would I describe it? Because I have practical reasons to do so. I'm not talking about the pervert who will describe it for who knows other reasons. I'm talking about the normal human being living on this earth, who is involved in things that we call acquisition of knowledge because he or she is interested in doing something with it, okay? In this respect, I have 3 examples for you to show how knowledge is changing. And as you see, for the time being, my notion and my focus on knowledge, on change is how is knowledge changing? And then we're going to look a little deeper. For the longest time, we looked at, for the longest, not so long, but still 300-400 years, we looked at the eye as being a lens. And even today, kids in school are taught that the eyes are very similar to a lens. After a while, we learned that there is more to the eye than only this physical reality that we describe as a lens. And we learned that the eye is representing very, very complicated neuronal processes. And that was a big success because we realized that the whole thing is not only the geometry of the lens and how do we maintain that lens functioning, but we learned that behind that lens there are those processes that actually transform the light that is hitting our eye into something that in the end turns out to be the image that I have with you sitting here. Without this kind of a perception of a visual nature, I would not see you. But this is also knowledge of yesterday. In reality, behind our seeing is the fact that we see with our brain. And you are going to look at me and say, wait a second, you are jumping. What is this? We see with our brain. What do you want to say when you say, we see with our brain? And I will start with a research that was made known in the last 3-4 months. A person who is affected by the loss of the visual cortex. It was affected by certain circumstances. It can happen. Don't wish it upon anyone, not even your enemies. And that person still has a very good lens. The eye is still in good shape. So they brought him to a university in Holland, in this case, very interesting, and they started experimenting. And they found out that there are ways in which this person can function in the world although the visual cortex was affected. And the question is, how does he see while the visual cortex is affected? And he sees because actually we don't see only with the eyes, we see through all our senses. They're all participating. So when they let this person go through the lab, they found out that there are processes that take place in the perception that start involving the way in which the sound is transformed into a source of information that goes into what we call seeing. But it's more than the sound. Differences in temperature. When you are close to an object, you have a different temperature than when you are far from the object. When you are close to a human being, you experience the temperature of that human being. So you have a whole process of integrating various sources of information that come through senses that we're aware of, because we have the conventional understanding of a limited number of senses, or through senses that we are not even aware of or we did not yet identify as such. That was an amazing experiment that will continue. In this case, I go back and I say, okay, we have a very interesting case. We even said that we see with our brain. How do we account for the change from the lens to the seeing with the brain? And we need to ask the question, what does it mean to observe the world? And we need to realize that this activity that we call to observe the world is not a simple taking in something and creating a representation of the world. Every time we take in the world, we are changing ourselves and we are changing the world that we observe. You are going to say, wait a second. At the moment when you look at me, you are changing me, and I'm willing to take a bet with everyone here in the room. Yes, I'm changing you. At the moment when I have an eye contact with you, there is a different reaction than before I had the eye contact. And that's the most obvious example. But the changes are sometimes more subtle. At the moment when we observe things, we do not simply take something in, put it in a pocket or write it in an article and publish it. We are at the same time changing our own state, and we return this change of the state with the knowledge that we brought in the world. So this is a very interesting situation in which the most important aspect of this taking in the world is the aspect of interaction. So basically, to know the world is to interact with the world. There is no other way to do it. It's very important to understand, especially in a day and age when we're inundated with the great statements about big data, that there is a distinction between data and information. The Germans have a wonderful saying, and I need to give it to you in German for those who speak German. I will translate it for the others. Wer viel misst, misst, misst. Those who measure a lot of garbage. Because data as such is dumb. The intelligence comes at the moment when you take your data, whatever it is, and you associate it with something else. This association is called to give meaning to the data. Only data with meaning is called information. We're using the word information in a manner that is not very precise. And we better be a little more precise at the moment when, let's say, the NSA is collecting data in the world to an extent that can scare everyone here. The amount is amazing. Is it data? Is it information? What is it? And basically, I will leave the question open because since I'm part of the data, it doesn't matter. What matters here is in changing our view of data and information, we start looking at what happens in us, the human being, when, for instance, we have a pain and the doctor says you have an inflammation. What does that mean? You need to attach a meaning to it. In this sense, I'm introducing to you a formalism that will go with us for the duration of the class, in which I say, if I have on one side a changing world to which I belong, there is no way not to belong to the changing world that you are going to observe, and I have a representation process, all what I'm doing by observing the world is to change the dynamics of the world. And this is an example, a very simple example. You had the Fukushima moment, and the Fukushima moment meant data on the Geiger counter, which for most of us means nothing. There are people there who were using the counter. It means a map in which people said, look, Fukushima starts affecting the United States. At that moment, there is a relation between what happened here, the danger in Fukushima, and the communication. And then you have another level at which somebody is talking about it, putting it in the news, telling people, look what happened, explaining. In the formalism that I'm using, I'm simply saying that the state of the world to which we belong changed. And this world to which we belong, we can look at it as a system. To look at the system means to understand that it has different states. And we look at the succession of states. Simple example, we can look at the world and we can take it in by measuring it. In order to do that, we have to calibrate the scale on which you are going to measure your weight tomorrow morning after the wonderful dinner this evening needs to be calibrated, because otherwise you are going to see 100 kilograms, and since it was not calibrated, maybe you are only 95 or whatever. Okay? Only those aspects of the natural world that interact with the discrimination procedure that we introduce, the scale in this case, are subject to our distinctions. There is a very important observation to be made. The most important aspect here is that all our representations are inductive in nature. And the question is, why would you worry? Because that blood pressure at 9:15 at the doctor's office after you drove through heavy traffic is really not saying anything about your blood pressure. It's totally irrelevant. So therefore, Apple decided that beginning yesterday or 2 days ago, we're going to have our blood pressure measured continuously in real time. And so all of you who will in the future put on the Apple Watch and use your iPhone is going to have his blood pressure measured continuously, and then you will know more whether there is a reason to worry or not. The doctor will be a little unhappy because no doctor in the world wants to get that amount of data and even interpret it for you when you give him a call. What is for me more important is that measurement means an interaction with a meter. What is a meter? Everybody looks at the meter as being something passive. In reality, you induce from your dynamics, the person who will be measured, you induce your dynamics into the dynamics of the meter. You are changing something in that meter by your very presence. It's not the other way around. Hey, here I'm going to the scale and say 95. Okay, that's the measurement. No, it is an interaction that happens there. What does this interaction, except for pressing the wrong button, what does this interaction tell us? It tells us something about the dynamics that we're trying to capture. In reality, nobody is interested in static data. We're all interested in how things are changing. If it would be only that you are 95 between now and the rest of your life, don't worry. Or maybe you should worry depending upon how tall you are. But you are more interested in what happens as time passes. So the notion of dynamics is a notion that goes to the number of states of your system as one follows the other. If you have a heart attack, then in the number of distinctions that somebody will establish, the heart attack will come with a value that does not fit so neatly in the description of the system. I'm claiming here something that is not new, but very few people are aware of, that to measure means to introduce a scale in reality, and that the result of your measurement should never be produced without identifying the scale. If you take this meter and you are going to start measuring the coast here near Bremen or along the canal near Delmenhorst, if that is your meter, you are going to, after you put it one after the other, you're going to say 3.9 kilometers. Now change the scale and go to such a meter. In other words, way shorter, and apply to the same coastline. You're going to say, wait a second, 1 point la 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 becomes now 5 point. Why? Because you are able to capture more details. In other words, the scale is start giving you details. If the scale is very vast, you take a meter that is 1 kilometer long and you apply it to the coastline, you are going to miss the granularity, you are going to miss the details. You are going to really have a description that might be useful for something but will not tell you. The fact that the length of the coastline depends upon the line of the distinction should be applied to everything that we measure, and you should be aware of it. I would like to bring to your attention the fact that we are living in a day and age when, yesterday on BBC, the question or the statement came, everything that we learn from science is wrong. And you can look at me and say, no, the statement is not mine, so don't shoot me. I'm not the author. But if you're going to read it, you're going to find out why such a statement is possible. And I'm going to scare you for a minute before going to the optimistic statement. And I'm going to scare you telling you the following thing. Somebody plotted the number of papers in medical research for the last 5 years. Then they plotted the number of tests that were replicated. So from a total amount of almost 15,000 such publications, they replicated less than 1,500, which means less than 1/10. From those replicated, 41% proved to be wrong. It's a scary number, because if you talk about medicine and you are in that number, then boy, I don't want to be in your shoes as I would like not to be in my shoes if this would apply to me. That's a very high level of error, and it's a very high level of science failing. That's the bad news. The good news, like never before in history did we advance in the possibility to capture at the finest possible level changes. So while we looked at changes on a global level, as long as we did not have the instruments, we are now looking at changes at a more and more fine granular level. That is a huge success. I would like you to take with you a distinction that some of you heard from me before, and which comes from a scientist who, in my opinion, would deserve a little more recognition, Windelband. And the distinction is between the ideographic science and the nomothetic science. Those who are active in the field of history should know that they are working in the ideographic science. They are working on describing events that are singular, that do not have the nature of a law. Sure, Karl Marx, if he would be here, would jump up and say, no. I came and I demonstrated that the history of mankind is all based on law and whatever. Then you would have the argument with Karl Marx, and I leave you alone having the argument with Karl Marx. However, we know, for instance, that the singularity, the uniqueness of certain human activities is such that they can only be defined as being ideographic. Physics is nomothetic. Physics is focused on scientific law. When you say scientific law, you say experiment. You can prove the law, or you can prove that the law is wrong. For instance, for a very long time before the telephone was invented and so forth, if I would have told my neighbor that I'm going to talk with Mr. Schneider, who is in Cambridge. I just put you in Cambridge for the sake of this lecture. They would have looked at me and say, you lost it. You cannot do that. Today, people will look at me and say, what's the big deal? You can talk even to people on the moon. Okay, if the NASA cooperates and whatever. So what seemed to be a law, that the sound will not propagate further than more or less within the seeing distance. I could scream and then he will hear me around the corner, but he will not hear me in Cambridge. Today, that law is still valid. The sound does not propagate further, but we were able, with the understanding of the physics, to do something so that that law will allow us to communicate at tremendous distances. In the observational method, we really end up with hypotheses. And in my books, the highest accomplishment in history is the production of hypotheses. In the experimental method, we start with hypotheses, which some will be proven right, some wrong. If I would have any role in what is called publications today, which is a big business, and that's one of the reasons why I will never have a role in it, okay? If I would have any role in publications, I would say, I would like you, when you publish your paper, to publish it not only with 30 or 50 or 100 names in the references. I want the data there. And I also want the negative results, the failed experiments. That's the only way in which you can talk about the notion of confirming something that is of a nature of a hypothesis. There are various types of change. I'm not going to test you at the beginning if you know them all. And one of the reasons I will not test you is because the list is open. And you might come to me and say, hey, there are 50 more. And I would say, sure. There are as many as forms of existence. We can represent that change in various forms, and in our days, we do more visualization than ever in the history of mankind. Visualization is a very intuitive way in which we can convey our understanding of change so that others can follow. But we can also do something called sonification. So it's not only images, it can be sounds. And we can do multimedia, and we can do virtual reality, and I'm not going to really insist on all these possible forms. The major question is if we deal with understanding the world in saying, what am I going to observe? I'm looking at you, and if anyone would come to me and say, what are your observables at this moment? I would have a tough time in defining 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 9. But in the end, given our limited abilities of processing the data, we have to make decisions as to what am I going to observe? What am I going to leave out? Is what am I going to leave out important or not? How do I know it before? How do I know it after the experiment? There are changes that are of a causal nature, and I might surprise some of you telling you that there are changes that are of an acausal nature. And here are changes that are of an acausal nature. An atomic nucleus emits particles. When I say thinking in models, I'm going back to Robert Rosen, and I had a beautiful discussion today with a young fellow who is a junior fellow here at Hanse, and I'm very happy that Hanse is doing that. And this image is inspired by Robert Rosen, who goes from the notion of, here I have nature, to which we belong as well, and here I have my attempt to represent nature. Well, what does the scientist do? The scientist takes this representation of nature and operates on this representation of nature. This image actually belongs to Stefan Maas. What happens here? We're talking about a number of processes, the most important being what we call the generation of a model. Every mathematician worth his salt will say, I can solve a problem if you give me a model. Then I can do something with it. Therefore, my encouragement to every one of you, myself included, if I have something that I would like to address, I need to work on a model. Does the work on a model suffice in order to solve the problem? That's the open question. And here I'm coming really to the core of our entire argument. If the world would be only the world of physics, we would have no problems in dealing with change, because physics is of such a nature that change can be expressed in relatively complete forms. The non-living is not in that condition. And please, at this moment, concentrate, be with me, don't get nervous, don't say, I have enough of this. A very important logician called Gödel, in reference to arithmetic from all things, a little more complicated, but I'm trying to keep it simple, comes to the observation according to which there are systems that can be completely and consistently described. There are other systems called undecidable that cannot be described completely and consistently. Let's look at this room. If somebody would come in, would say, I can give you a complete description of this room, I would claim, probably you cannot. There are so many wonderful personalities here that each of them is an infinite world, if you are realistic. But if this room would be not a room with human beings sitting on the tables and with children running around, because they are part already of this environment. If this room would be a collection of stones, and now I'm at the stone level, so that you know. This is the first promise kept. I'll give it back to you. If this would be a room of stones, we would be able to give a complete and consistent description of this world. What does it mean? Over time, let's say in 100 years, in 1,000 years, you name it, million, go for millions. Go for billions of years, because when we talk about the history of existence on the earth, we're talking about billions of years. In the billions of years, we know this will turn into sand, this will turn eventually into the elements from which the stone is made. Yeah? Any objection to this? If you have an objection, scream now, otherwise you are married to my theory. Okay, good. Having said that, even if instead of having us here in this room, we would have only acorns, the description would not be so easy. And in the end, it will prove to be a description in which, if you want to describe it completely, it is not going to be a consistent. In other words, if you describe it completely, it's going to have sentences that will contradict each other. That is what is called the undecidable. My claim is, and I introduced to you what I call the G complexity, my claim is that the living is defined by G complexity. The living cannot be described completely and consistently. Here's an example in which brilliant work. Hodgkin Huxley, 1952, a beautiful description, absolutely beautiful description, which brought them a Nobel Prize, by the way. Saying, I'm going to look at the neuron, and here is that part of nature that they were looking at. They looked for something that was easier to describe. Yeah? I'm going to look at the neuron, and I'm going to fully describe it. In order to fully describe it, you would have to reduce it. What's the reduction that they offered? The reduction that they offered is this little model that you see here. It's almost an electronic circuit. In addition, they were able to produce the equations for it. It's beautiful. As I said, it brought them a Nobel Prize. It's beautiful. As I said, if you ever are going to need a device to help your hearing, it's going to be based on this observation, that you can do a reduction. But it's never going to be at the level of complexity of this element of nature that it describes. So in the reactive model of the neuron, we have a simple problem. And this is the reactive model of the neuron. I'm going to show it again to you. This is the circuit. And we have here in this room, am I allowed to identify you as an expert in neural? Sure. He got a PhD and etc. In this, we have a very, very wonderful description of what can happen. The whole thing has only a couple of Schönheitsfehler, to use again a German expression, beauty deficiencies. It turns out that the neuron is more than only a circuit that functions in one direction. It turns out, and on this note I will mention to you research as recent as yesterday, that you have a signal hitting your neuron, propagating in one direction. And interestingly enough, the same neuron can get a signal propagating in the other direction. The Hodgkin-Huxley doesn't allow for it. It is a circuit that accepts input only in one direction. This is where is the input, and this is where it's going to go out. In reality, the neuron can be addressed from many directions. More than that, we live by the notion that the entire amount of information that comes to the neuron will come from outside. It turns out that we generate continuously information, as opposed to the stone that will never generate information. This acorn, and respected for that, generates information to the extent that I can guarantee you that if you plant it, it's not going to turn into a pear tree. You realize that. For that to happen, the amount of information that is generated and the type of dynamics involved in the acorn is such that a mathematician of the highest level you can imagine, Gelfand, if, mathematics is not a candidate for Nobel Prizes. There is no Nobel Prize in mathematics, but there is a Tokyo Prize for mathematicians. Gelfand, who was one of them, was talking about the soul of a neuron. He was not a mystical guy. He was a really strong mathematician. He was talking actually about the fact that the neuron is more than only the reality of electric potentials, and he was realizing that the neuron, which is actually present in our entire body, there's no part of your body where there are no neurons. People only think about neurons being here. Yeah? They extend all over. They are part of this tremendous reality, and part of them are processing sensory information that comes from outside. Part are processing what we as the living generate. Now, when I say we are part of the living, but we are not the only part of the living. There are wonderful projects going on at this moment in the world, one in Germany at this time, absolutely wonderful projects in which people working on the neuron model that I showed you are trying to simulate how the brain works. Is an integrated science, which means is an integrated view of change possible? I'm not going to, at this moment, challenge you by explaining to you the Schrödinger equation, which is one of those marvels of science. However, I will bring to your attention that he wrote a book called What is Life? And in his book, he is not only making reference to what we know from physics, he is trying to find out what defines the living. I will, however, bring to your attention that for the longest time, when people talked about change, they talked about movement. Something moved from A to B. So if you have a good equation, this will be the description. And since Galileo did not have good mathematical skills, his description was in words. The dialogues from Galileo were words. Somebody else came later and transformed it into an equation. And we have various representations that go into the quantum. One of the consequences of the beautiful theory from Schrödinger is the fact that he considered that the proteins are binding due to their vibrations. If they are vibrating, then the expectation is that you can hear the vibration. You can means we not, because we're in the domain of 20 hertz to 20,000. Those vibrations happen to be in the terahertz domain. You have change also in the domain where we do not have neurons. And on this notion, I'm going to invite you to come to the conference Monday, I think. Novoplansky from Israel is coming. He's going to talk about the intelligence in the plants. He's going to talk about the fact, and hold on, hold your breath, yeah? It is possible that when this acorn becomes an acorn tree and has its own acorns, so think about you having your children, etc., yeah? The tree that will grow from the next generation of acorns, the tree will recognize its kin, like you recognize your babies. And you say, wait a second, I recognize my children, my wife was pregnant, and, I cleaned their diapers and whatever is involved. Sure, I recognize them. There is the same recognition at the level of plants where you don't have neurons. So it's not only a matter of intelligence, it's a matter of a very complex behavior that pertains to the living. Even in language, in art, in architecture, these are very important aspects. Sorry for not giving them more attention. I claim that the most important characteristic and the definitory characteristic of the living is anticipation. And anticipation means that in a system endowed with anticipation, a future state is affecting the current state. To which extent this can happen, I'll tell you at some other time. However, I can tell you why it happens. As opposed to the physical reality, such as this car, that has only one outcome. You press the pedal and the car will start and take you from A to B. In the living, you have a multitude of outcomes. If you look at the respiration, the outcome is not only the fuel for the body, but the energy, the byproducts of. Or if you look at photosynthesis, you have the same thing, the multitude of outcomes. Think about art having a multitude of outcomes. The non-living is reducible to parts, the living is not. I'm going to finish on this example. Pregnancy is probably one of the most powerful examples of anticipation one can give. For those of you who gave birth, what I'm going to say might even feel like an offense. Here's a guy who never gave birth and tells somebody who gave birth what it means. No. However, for all of you, imagine you have your body and then you have a big piece, a big chunk, which is heavy in front of you. Normally, you would lose your balance and you will fall on your nose. That's the physics. Most of the time, women do not fall on their nose during their pregnancy. I say most of the time, there are always accidents. It's interesting how, in the process of being pregnant, the body of the woman is changing. The architecture of this body is changing as to allow for this maintaining of the balance. But that's not enough. Pregnancy affects cerebral and cognitive processes. There are experiments, for instance, and I'm not going to compare rats and human beings, mothers, rats and mothers, human beings, but you know, that from which food was hidden. The pregnant rat would find the food 10 times faster than the non-pregnant rat. You realize what anticipation means in this case. It's an augmented cognitive ability. And finally, the most interesting for me, which was for me an almost a shock. Sure, we take it for granted that the mother gives birth and there's going to be a baby that will have milk. Really? Who knows exactly how you prepare a body in advance to produce milk from blood in a sequence of processes that are far from being trivial? And how do you prepare all this process in which you have many components, such as the changing of the physical properties of the breast? That breast is going to be affected by the fact that a baby will eventually try to get milk, yeah? And will not know that that baby can cause pain to the mother, and so forth. All those changes are in anticipation and not in reaction. The body doesn't wait. Here is the baby, and now I'll take 2 weeks and I will start preparing the milk for you and warm it up to the right place. The level of oxytocin receptors in the mother is changing. That is a tremendously important dimension. For those of you who ever had problems of a cognitive nature, you would know what oxytocin would mean. A theory of change is supposed to advance a hypothesis for what change is, and, more important, what engenders change. Change is, as we have seen, the outcome of many, many interactions.